Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 7th episode of the Svarim Cheddar Shabsai Tzvi series. On this episode of the series, I was joined by Professor Adam Teller to discuss the impact of Tach V'Tat on Sabbateanism and how the two relate. Once again, I would like to thank the corporate sponsor of the series, Gluck Plumbing. For all your service needs, big or small in New Jersey, with a full service division, from boiler changeouts, main sewer line snakeouts, cameraing main lines, to a simple faucet leak, Gluck Plumbing Service Division has you covered. Give them a call, 732-523-1836, extension 1. That's 732-523-1836, extension 1. If anyone has any comments or questions, or would like to sponsor an episode or to support the podcast, please email me, svarimcheddar@gmail.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Svarim Chatter podcast and another episode in the ongoing Shabsai Tzvi series. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Professor Adam Teller, who is Professor of History and Judaic Studies at Brown University. And we'll be discussing an article that he wrote, which is discussed in his book as well. His book is called Rescue the Surviving Souls, the Great Jewish Refugee Crisis of the 17th Century, about Tach V'Tat and the aftermath, published by Princeton University Press, which actually, Professor Teller was on the podcast when it was still live shows, so people can check that out a while back. And this article is about Tach V'Tat and especially how it relates to the rise of Sabbateanism 2 decades later. So first of all, thank you, Professor Teller, for joining me once again.
It's a real pleasure to be here. I had a great time last time, so I'm happy to be back.
Thank you. So obviously, like I mentioned, people can go back and listen to the previous episode and read the book on Tach V'Tat, and maybe they know a little about Tach V'Tat, but I think we should start off with a brief recap of Tach V'Tat, when it was, and in short, what happened, and especially as it relates to what we're going to be discussing about how it relates to Sabbateanism.
Okay. So Tach V'Tat started off as a huge wave of pogroms in Ukraine in 1648. It started off as a military rebellion of the Ukrainian Cossack forces against the Polish state, but very soon turned into a huge popular uprising, during which the Jews were targeted particularly by the peasant masses, as they were acting as agents of the Catholic Polish nobility, which were felt to be exploiting and making the peasants' lives very difficult. As a part of that uprising, the Cossacks did a deal with a group called the Tatars, who lived on the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea, and who made their money from slaving. So as a part of those wars, the Cossacks and the Tatars captured Jews, killed Jews, and quite a large number were taken as slaves back to Istanbul and put for sale on the slave market. It was a moment of huge destruction for the Jews of Ukraine, which had been a really important economic center in Eastern Europe for the Jews before then. Unfortunately, both for Poland and for Polish Jews, when that uprising sort of died down in 1654, 2 other wars broke out. One with Russia on the eastern border, where the Russians invaded through Lithuania and into Poland, and one with Sweden from the north, which they came from the Baltic. They came down through Poznan and Warsaw to Krakow. And in both those cases, Jews were targeted. They were also targeted by the Poles as they fought to push the Swedes out. So it all comes to an end in about 1667. So you've got about 20 years of massive wars, incredible destruction. I mean, 90% of the houses, crop yields are down 80, 90%. And so Poland is in tatters, and Polish Jewry are also in tatters. And that's the first thing we're going to have to bear in mind, is that what had been before 1648, the major center of Jewish life in Europe, the richest, the best organized, right, was now, wiped out. Not totally wiped out, because it reconstructed itself, but wiped out. That's those are the wars that are sort of a key moment as far as we're concerned. And in the Jewish popular memory, Tach V'Tat, right, they were called Chorban. That was like Chorban Bayit Sheni. This was the worst thing that happened since Chorban Bayit Sheni. And in fact, in the Jewish popular memory, until the Shoah, this was the archetypal terrible thing that happened to the Jews. So that's really one aspect. The other aspect I want to mention now, but there are 2 aspects. One is those Jews who were captured and sold as slaves in Istanbul. Of course, Pidyon Shurim is a mitzvah rabbi. It's a major mitzvah. And so the whole Jewish world organized to raise money in order to ransom the Jews who were being sold in Istanbul. That was a massive, huge worldwide campaign, at the heart of which was the Sephardic community of Venice. They had a whole Sephardic network which raised money, but Ashkenazic Jews too chipped in to try and rescue those Jews. The last point I will mention here, because it's important to us, is that, so, when Polish Jewry was beginning to try to reconstruct itself, at the same time as other Jews were trying to ransom the slaves in Istanbul, huge amounts of money were needed. And so, a really massive and multifaceted fundraising campaign started. Now, some of it, as I said, was Pidyon Shurim. But in addition, Jewish communities in Poland would send emissaries around to other Jewish communities, Amsterdam, Venice, Livorno, and so on, trying to raise money to reconstruct their lives. And there are also individuals who are either personally refugees or have got family that need to be ransomed, who are traveling around trying to raise money. And so you have this situation of letters being written and people traveling around and demands on money. The very, very last point here is that those emissaries, as they were traveling around, also were deeply engaged, not just in visiting places, but in writing to other places to prepare where they were coming, and they had people writing for them. And some of them, the more educated, in order to raise money, either to cover the costs of the traveling or to help raise money to rescue their family, would publish books and sell them. That's kind of an entrepreneurial way of raising money that they needed. And so the period from about 1650 to about 1660, 1670 maybe, right, you have all of this happening inside Europe and in the Mediterranean, right, trying to come to terms with this major moment of disaster in Eastern Europe. That's what the book is about. The book is about the refugees and how they were helped.
Correct. And people can read more about that in the book, which will be linked in the show's description, as well as in our previous episode, which maybe I'll just put the link, even though people can scroll back and find it, I'll put the link in the description as well. You can just click on it and see the previous discussion. So before we get to, I think we'll go, before we get to how this affected the rise of Sabbateanism, like I said, 2 decades later, this was in 48, 49, we should mention, to pick up on something that you just mentioned there at the end. There was the emissaries from Israel, the going and collecting money, the development of this trans-regional, this philanthropic network, as you call it. Just what's the history there? Talk a little bit about that as we can work our way through towards the impact that this had.
Yeah, so as I said, Pidyon Shurim was a mitzvah rabbi. It's mentioned in the Talmud. Rabbeinu Rav Ashi had a famous discussion about items that can be used for building Bet Knesset. The Rambam in the Mishneh Torah also talks about it and suggests that it is, even more important than much of the money raised for tzedakah. And so when the refugee crisis is happening, right, there is a lot of effort being devoted to sort of dealing with the refugees and Pidyon Shurim. However, alongside that, there was another mitzvah which needed to be dealt with. And that was what they call Aniei Eretz Yisrael, which is supporting Jewish settlement in the land of Israel. Okay, in the Middle Ages, it had been, the settlement itself had not been major, and though money was always raised for those Jews who were there, it was not a huge thing. Starting in the early modern period with the rise of the Ottoman Empire, which opened up settlement in the land of Israel because the Jews were not seen as hated enemies in the same way as they were by the Christians. You see suddenly Jews settling in the land of Israel and new Jewish communities developing. Tzfat, right, the major industrial center of cloth manufacture. Yerushalayim, of course, right, more and more Jews come to Yerushalayim and settle there and live there. These communities, even though Tzfat initially at least is really quite a profitable place, there's a lot of money, right, they need money to support themselves, and particularly to support the yeshivot and the bachurim who are studying there and so on. And so, in parallel with the money for Pidyon Shvuim, you have money for Aniyei Eretz Yisrael, right? And if you look in the Shulchan Aruch, Caro he sort of emphasizes it quite strongly, setting up a tension in fundraising. I mean, there is a serious tension in fundraising between those who want to raise money for Pidyon Shvuim, right? And that's not just captives. There are pirates in the Mediterranean, and people are for all kinds of reasons, being stopped and arrested. And you have the people raising money for Aniyei Eretz Yisrael, traveling around to the same places, right? And trying to squeeze money out of each community. I've got a really lovely quotation from the community in Fez, Davka. I'm going to find it here. It's a bit later, in 1678, in which the community is sort of apologizing why it hasn't given as much money as it wanted to, is to the local poor. He said, we have not managed to give them what we ought to have because of all the needy people coming here, particularly the emissaries from the land of Israel and the Ashkenazim ransoming captives who come one after the other. And when we try to keep back some of the money for the poor of our own town, they don't agree and take everything. Right? So you have this picture, right, of the fundraisers coming around. They're very aggressive, right? They're in competition with each other. They're in competition with the locals, and it's a big thing. And that is a background, right, for something that's going to develop following Tach V'Tat. Like the need not just to deal with the refugees, but to deal with Jewish settlement in the land of Israel as it grows and develops. I just want to say one thing about fundraising in Europe in particular. It's a very interesting phenomenon. The major communities and the big regional councils, the Council of Four Lands in Poland, the Lithuanian Council, right, mandate collecting money for Eretz Yisrael. It's part of their regulations that you have to do. And even during the wars, they don't give any kind of a relief. That money has to be collected. But it's funneled to a number of what they call Nisiei Eretz Yisrael, who collected all the funds. They were kind of these collecting points for funds to go to Israel. So in Lvov, in Poland, there was one. Later on, that was in Prague. You have one in Venice. Right? And so there is this really Europe-wide system of collecting money for the land of Israel. Of course, there are also individual donations. That's often done by investing in the community. Someone gives money to the community, and then it's invested, and then the fruits of that investment are sent to Yerushalayim. This is a system that really works very well in the first half of the 17th century, particularly because Poland is such a rich place. Right? Poland is a flourishing and burgeoning, and its economy is doing very well, and there's lots of money floating around. And so it can afford to send significant amounts of money to the land of Israel to support particularly Ashkenazic Jews who are there. And the main center for them is Yerushalayim. And so what happens following 1648, right, is, well, two things happen. First of all, the Ottoman economy declines. And so the settlements in the land of Israel are by no means as rich as they were. So they need more money, right? Then they begin to send out their own emissaries, right? Shluchei de Rabbanan, Shadarim, whose job it is, just like the emissaries ransoming captives or ransoming people captured by pirates or the refugees, they're also now traveling around Europe, these Shadarim, trying to raise money. It's never enough, right? And the situation for the Jews in the land of Israel, really, after Poland stops sending money, declines drastically, right, and needs to be dealt with. I'm trying to fit a lot of information into a very small space, so I hope it's clear.
Absolutely right. Like I said, that's why I referenced before the book in the previous podcast, because the book really breaks this down much more, in depth of what was going on. I mean, that's why, right? So this is what you mean also with the philanthropic networks. I think I remember, is that the Meir Ben Yo published those letters from Shmuel Abov to Moshe Zakuto?
We'll get to Shmuel Abu and Zakut in a moment. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, they're important to touch on. I don't know if you want to get them now about the how. So then this, or although we probably should get to, I guess, before that. I mean, this is really what you were saying. How this really affected the community in Yerushalayim and Eretz Israel overall, and Israel overall. That this, so really, Tach V'Tat had this direct reaction on them. Just from a monetary,
absolute direct knock-on effect. Right? The Jews in Jerusalem, in particular, the Ashkenazic Jews, are totally reliant on the money coming from Eastern Europe. There are Jews in Germany, but not too many, and it's not very wealthy. They're going through the 30 Years' War, which only ends in 1648. So things are not good there. And suddenly, first of all from Ukraine in 1648, and then from the rest of Poland with the other wars, that money dries up entirely. And in order to survive, the Jews of Jerusalem the Ashkenazi Jews have to find other sources of income. Now, of course, there are Sephardic Jews, but they tend to have separate financing. Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews are not cooperating over this. And that carries on right into the part of the 18th century. Matthias Lehmann's got a wonderful book about the Shadarim in the 18th century. And this continues. So they're not much help. So the Ashkenazi Jews actually begin to take loans from their non-Jewish neighbors, from the Muslim neighbors, which of course very soon transpires that they can't pay back. And as they fall into debt, right, their creditors begin to confiscate their property, close their synagogues, right, and make their life really, really difficult. And so the debt crisis sort of spirals out of control.
Right. So now they have this effect. This is what happens to like you're saying, the Ashkenazi community in Yerushalayim and Israel as a whole. So, I mean, how did they overcome this issue that clearly, like you said in your book, you deal with extensively? There was because of the competing charities going on with the slave trade, with post Tach V'Tat, and the lack of money, and all these different issues. How did the Jews in Yerushalayim, in Israel, overcome this?
Right. Well, what they have to do, right, is get people out. They have to send people out to raise money. And the starting point is always Venice. Venice is the big clearinghouse for all of the fundraising in the Mediterranean, whether it's for Pidyon Shurim or for Aniyei Eretz Israel. And they have to find people who they can send out in order to raise money, right? And to do it in a situation of competition with the Jews of Poland, right? Because what's happened to the Jews of Poland, there's so many dead and so much suffering, and people are already focused on that. So the Jews of Jerusalem have got to try and find a way around it. And so they do, right? They send out Ashkenazic scholars, right? And send them not just to Ashkenazic communities, but to Sephardic communities too. I'll come to one very important one in a minute. And they do bring money. Money begins to flow in. As it flows in, however, right, it's taken immediately and sent to service the debt, right? Because that's the major danger facing the Jews of Jerusalem, right? If their Muslim neighbors get upset, then that can become physical danger, not just economic problems. So they need to do that. But that means that the economic problems of the people are not solved. And the Jews of Yerushalayim, right, starve. Right? There isn't enough to eat. Right? And we have records of people who were there, Christians who were there, English Christians who were there, talking about, I've got another quotation if I can find it. Here we are. So it's a quotation from an English priest. He says, the state of the Jews at Jerusalem of late, so the mid-1650s, was such that they could not live and subsist there without some yearly supply and contribution from their brethren abroad. But since the desolation brought by war on Poland, they have been in great extremity of want, insomuch that in the year 1655, 400 of their widows were famished to death. Okay, so people are dying in large numbers, particularly women. And this is another crisis that develops. And so what you see, the Jews of Jerusalem are really, they're really in desperate straits. And so two really interesting things happen. First, the women, something unheard of in Jewish history. The women of Yerushalayim organize together. They send their own emissary, a man called Shmuel Levi from Frankfurt, right, who is an emissary of the women of Jerusalem. They send him to the women of the Ashkenazic women in Europe, particularly in Germany, and they say, you approach the women, you get the women to send us money. We want a women-to-women's economic philanthropic network. Luckily for us, Levi published that he had a letter of introduction, which he published. So it survived. And we have this one copy of the little booklet survived, in which we can hear the voice of the women of Jerusalem saying to the women of Germany and Poland, raise money, set up your own gabitas, right? And raise money from women, collect it. You have to give it to the men to send to Eretz HaKodesh, but note that it's for women. And so the men here won't steal it from us, right? And so under the pressure of what's happening to the land of Israel in the 1650s, you have this attempt by the women to set up their own ransoming network, something unheard of. I don't think it works because we don't hear much about it later, but it's a sign of how difficult things were. Much more important moment, however, is what the men did. Because the men choose a great Kabbalist, one of those living in Jerusalem, a man called Natan Shapira, and they send him off to be their shadal. Now, this is good because he was actually from Krakow, so he's a Polish Jew. So he can, when people say we should be supporting the Polish Jews, he's coming across as a Polish Jew. So that's a smart bit of fundraising, right? They've worked something out. And what he does, he travels to Venice to help fund his trip. He publishes a book called Tach V'Tat, which is to encourage donations, particularly from Sephardic Jews. And then he travels around Europe, like starting once again with Shmuel Aboab and Moshe Zakuto in Venice, who are the key fundraisers. And they give him letters of introduction to travel to Amsterdam, which is the richest community in Western Europe by a long, long way. And while he's there, first of all, he meets a very famous rabbi called Menashe ben Israel. So lots of bits for him, who is just about to travel to London in order to have the Jews of Amsterdam accepted back into England after a long time. And he's really interested in what he hears from Shapiro, because he knows that in London, like in Amsterdam, there are a lot of very radical Protestants, millenarians, right, who are really interested in the Jews settling in the land of Israel, because that is, as far as they're concerned, the moment before the Messiah comes, right? And so Menashe ben Israel makes a note of this and goes to England. And when he's talking to in the parliamentary committee, right, he has this is mentioned, right, that money, the Jews need money to settle the land of Israel. And Shapiro in Amsterdam makes contact with non-Jews who get really excited, and they give him money, which he sends back to Yerushalayim. This is important when we talk about Shabtaut, because this is cross-cultural, cross-religious contact, right, between Jews and non-Jews, right, of a new and unheard of kind. This had never happened before. Interestingly, to this day, we know that evangelical Protestants like to support her. I mean, to this day, they're giving money to Eretz Israel. This is the first time. It starts here. And so, this guy is actually talking to them, right? It's very problematic because you're not supposed to take money from Goyim for charity. But he argues, not unreasonably, that since he's not getting enough money from the Jews, the Shulchan Aruch allows it, which is true. In Yoreh De'ah, if there's not enough Jewish charity, you can take charity from non-Jews. The money goes back to Jerusalem, and of course, he's put to use. Next year, he goes back again. He meets them again, these Protestants. Right? He meets Jews as well in other places. He's not unsuccessful as a fundraiser. And they have more discussions about religion. And these Christians show him the Sermon on the Mount, which he says to them that he thinks it's a really important text. And it's if people would keep this, they would be more holy than many of the Jews he knows. And then he starts talking about the Messiah and brings a take on the passage in Yeshayahu, which the Christians call the suffering servant passage, right, which they interpret as the prophecy for the coming of the Messiah. And he agrees with them, right, and says, yes, the way you read this passage from Yeshayahu, exactly that. This is messianic. And so the Christians get really excited because it looks as if Shapiro is now sort of, accepting Christological approaches to the Tanakh, to the Bible, which encourages them to give a lot of money, which they do. And so do the Jews, so do the Christians in England. This is also an incredibly important moment, I think, right? Because all of a sudden, they're not just collecting money, they're discussing the Mashiach and what this means. And I have no doubt that this is playing into the background of what we're going to see in Yerushalayim if I can ever get there. So I'm trying very hard to go very fast in order to get there. Shapiro sends the money back. The Jews of England send a conversionary letter along with it saying, okay, we're giving you the money, but there's a reason. We don't like Jews, we like Christians. Here's the money, deal with it. And so there's a big discussion in the Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, which is run by Yaakov Hagiz, right? Can we take the money or not? And in his Shelos and Tshuvot, there is a tshuva. It's a very short, he wrote very short tshuvot, very pithy tshuvot, discussing whether or not this money can be used. And in the end, he thinks it can be used. I can go into it if you want to, but I want to get to other places.
You could finish the story. Also, I'll mention his Ramosha Chagiz's father, and his chuvas is called the Hilchas Halachas Ketanos, or Halachas Ketanos.
That video, exactly right.
Yeah,
exactly.
little short thing. So you could just quickly, once we're, like I said, this is all, I know people listening to this we're giving the whole history of Tach V'Tat and the tzedakah and the charity, but this is very important, as you explain in your articles, to explain why this relates to Sabbateanism. So we'll get there, but maybe explain the reason, sure.
Okay, so the arguments that are made are this. Shapiro and the people who want to take the money try to argue, first of all, that these are radical Protestants. They don't have idols. They don't have figures in the church, right? And so they're not akum in the real sense of the word, right? They are acceptable. In addition, somebody raises the idea that perhaps these are the descendants of the Jews of England who were expelled in 1290, but actually stayed in place. So these aren't Goyim at all, these are Jews. Right? Yeah, I know, it's a stretch. Right? Hagiz is not very excited by taking money from non-Jews at all. He absolutely rejects the idea that even if the Jews are converted, then you could take money from them, because if they've converted, then they're pasul anyway, so you can't have them. He argued that since the money has been given already and is being used, and a lot of it has already been used because they didn't wait, right, we can just let it pass. So he's sort of laissez-faire approach. He doesn't give a really clear halachic ruling. I think the information is not clear enough to do it. But anyway, he simply says, forget the arguments. The money is important, and we need to use it, and it's being used for this purpose, and so we can all move on. This finally gets us to Tach V'Tat. Not to Tach V'Tat, I mean, sorry, it's against the Shabtaut. Because as Hagiz is discussing this issue in the yeshiva, which presumably he did, I mean, this is an important matter, and it's life and death for the Jews of Yerushalayim, right? His star pupil, right, was a young man by the name of Avraham Natan ben Elisha Chaim Ashkenazi, right? who was one of the greatest students he had, right, and would later become the prophet of Shabtai Tzvi. And so, as he was a student, he was already learning, right, about these cross-cultural contacts between Jews and Christians and non-Jews, right, and the meaning of it, and the messianic importance of it. And all of this was coming back to him, and he was learning, and this was in his background, right, when he met Shabtai Tzvi, and Shabtai Tzvi made his claim to be the Messiah. So it's kind of, it's what they say in Hebrew, it's a daisa gdola, right? There's lots of things bubbling around at the same time. But at the heart of it is Nathan of Gaza, or the man who will become Nathan of Gaza, right? I think what we need to do at this moment is take a stop with the story. And I've got to make a better connection between what we're talking about and the Sabbatean movement. If that's okay.
Absolutely. I would just throw in, before you make the connection, I would just mention also that Nathan, like I said, not only is he sitting in the yeshiva and hearing all of this, he also, like I said, the financial hardship is affecting him. And clearly he's hearing about this is going on from Tach V'Tat, as well as his father, Elisha, is sent to collect money. So his own household. So he clearly is feeling all of this.
We'll get back to it, but absolutely.
I just wanted to mention that here already. Yeah,
okay, fine. Okay. So now, Shabtai and Tach V'Tat have been discussed a lot, right? The first and major scholar of the Sabbatean movement, Gershon Sholem, thought a lot in his younger years about a possible connection, because Tach V'Tat was this major crisis, disaster that hit the Jews. Was Sabbateanism some kind of response to that? And in an early piece that he wrote, he argues in favor of that. When he comes to write his big book, however, he's decided that he doesn't think that's the case. He argues that what happens in Poland is limited. It's limited to Poland. So why would a Jew in Morocco or London or anywhere else care, right? He looked for a reason, right, that spanned the entire Jewish world that would make Sabbateanism a worldwide movement. His argument was the spread of Lurianic Kabbalah, right? And that's a keystone of his thesis. And he traces all the expressions of Lurianic Kabbalah in all the different places, right, where Shabtai Tzvi was accepted as the Messiah. And for a very long time, I mean, Sholem was such a giant in the field that was accepted pretty much without argument. I mean, there were people who argued against it. That's a scholar in Israel called Israel Halperin, who actually worked on Tach V'Tat, wrote a very nice piece, sort of gently. You couldn't argue directly with Sholem because he was a difficult man. So gently trying to suggest that maybe Sholem, there was another point of view, but it wasn't taken on. It took Sholem's death and the rise of a new generation of scholars to start to rethink this issue. And it was attacked in two ways. I'm sure you've discussed this. Moshe Idel in Hebrew University did another check and decided that Sholem was wrong, that the Lurianic Kabbalah was so widespread before Shabtai Tzvi. He said you did see it, but only here and there. It's not what Sholem claims, that it's this worldwide thing, which is going to allow Shabtai to become a worldwide phenomenon. And so, I mean, that's still controversial. For a long time, Edel was accepted, but now I can hear my colleagues pushing back against Edel. So it's an ongoing polemic. Other scholars, though, Yaakov Barnai in Haifa, who wrote a book about the social aspects of Sabbateanism, and the late Adar Bud Albert in the University College London, sort of attacked it from a different angle and tried to see how Tach V'Tat was really important for the development of Sabbateanism and Shabtai Tzvi himself. And they found a number of different things. First of all, I think I said it in our last interview, Shabtai Tzvi married a refugee from Poland. His wife, right, was a refugee from Ukraine, a strange woman, but very important in the history of Shabtai. When he meets Polish Jews who come to, and after he's declared himself, he tells them that he knows about Tach. He's read the Hebrew chronicles of the war. So he's up to date. He understands what they've been going through. when he's asked about the predecessor, right? He's Mashiach ben David, but there's a Mashiach ben Yosef who is supposed to come previous to him. Who is that? He says he was an unknown Jew who'd been killed in Tach V'Tat. Natan himself, in one of his texts, his prophecies, right, talks about Shabtai Tzvi usurping the Sultan, right, and then together with him conquering the world. And Natan adds, this is going to be without bloodshed, and Shabtai Tzvi will only wreak vengeance on the towns of Poland where the blood of our brethren was shed in these provinces. So Barnay and Raphael Albert argued that if you look at the Shabbat, the teachings and the prophecies of Shabbat, you can see just how important what happened to the Jews of Poland was, and that you can't ignore it as one of the major causes for the spread of Shabbat. I tried to take a different angle on it, because I'm not a historian of religion. That isn't what I do. I'm a social economic historian. And that means that when I examine a phenomenon like the Sabbatean movement, I ask a different set of questions. It's not that the questions the historians of religion are asking are not very, very important, because of course they are, right? But they're not the ones that I ask. I look at things from a slightly different perspective. So when I think about the wide and broad appeal of Sabbateanism, I'm less interested, right, in the patterns of thought and the new ideologies and the way that the Kabbalah is reinvented and all of those things that are so important. But I ask quite simply, how was it that these new ideas were able to be spread so very, very quickly? Because it's a year, 2 years, and the whole Jewish world is up in arms, is on its feet. And when he converts, that news travels very fast. And so I asked that question, not what was it in the way he thought, but what was the world like that allowed this to happen? Because it sounds prosaic, right? That's more exciting to think about all this kind of, antinomianism and redefining Kabbalah. And I'm just talking about where people traveling from place to place. However, it's actually very, very important, right? Ideas do not exist in a vacuum. Without somebody carrying an idea from place to place or expressing an idea, it doesn't exist. And it can't move. Even books, right? A book is nothing if it's not read by somebody. And if you want a book to be read widely, it has to be spread widely. So when I came to start thinking about this problem, those were the questions I began to ask. How was it, right, that Shabbat really spread across the world like wildfire? 100 years previously, there had been false messiahs and nothing new, but none of them prior to Shabtai Tzvi had ever managed to do what he did, right, to touch the entire Jewish world. And that's where I went back finally to all the stuff that I've been talking about until now, right? Because I suddenly realized that there was in existence a worldwide web of connections between Jewish communities that allowed information about what was happening in Poland to be moved from place to place. Information about the need to redeem slaves and the redemption of slaves in Istanbul and other places. It allowed money to travel across borders, right? It was a way that letters would be sent, right? Fundraising letters, information letters would be sent from place to place. And even publishing. These people who are traveling are publishing books along the way in order to help this movement. So then I suddenly started to think about how it could be, right, that this already existing sort of informational network could play into the development of Sabbateanism, because it's, to my way of thinking, it's too much of a coincidence, right? It's not logical. But it didn't take me very long when I started looking to find out, right, that there is exactly a linchpin a person, right, who in his life, in his experience, shows the connection between those things. And that's, you've already mentioned him, and that's Nathan of Gaza, right, who was born in the early 40s, early 1640s, a little bit before Tach V'Tat, but he was very young when Tach V'Tat broke out. He was raised in Jerusalem. And so when people starved in Jerusalem, his family starved and he starved, right? So he felt, the significance of what was happening in Poland on his own flesh and on his own family. As he said, his father was one of the first Ashkenazim sent out to raise money for the starving Jews of Jerusalem. They sent him, first of all, to North Africa. So he goes around North Africa. It's actually a very sad story because he goes around North Africa. He actually does quite well, gets to Venice, and then his partner converts to Christianity and takes all the money. So he ends up with that. So he has to continue. He doesn't go back home. He goes on. He goes up into Germany and Poland and raises a whole lot more money, which means he's away from home for 15 years. So Nathan of Gaza grows up without a father, right? Because of the conditions, right, of the post-Tach V'Tat world and the issue of fundraising for the land of Israel. Of course, he's in contact with his father by letters are coming, being sent, right? Information is being moved around. This is Nathan's world. Right? This is what he grows up in. He understands this because he's lived it. As I said, he's also deeply involved in the interreligious contacts that preceded, this Sabbatean movement. He's seen that Jews and non-Jews can talk about these matters and find common language. And so when Shabtai Tzvi sort of declares himself, Nathan is absolutely centrally placed, right, to take advantage of this new reality in order to spread the word about the Sabbatean movement. Yeah, how I teach, I go around in a big circle. It sounds like I start saying stuff at the beginning, what's it got to do with anything? In the end, tie a little bow and try to hold everything up.
And this really, really makes a lot of sense. This really, reading your paper, and I read it, and what you've been saying, it really, one of the previous episodes, listeners maybe heard that I talk about it. We discussed Nathan and the impact. It's like you mentioned, someone was sitting in Eretz Yisrael, and suddenly this just exploded everywhere. It's like he was running a social media campaign in the 17th century, a WhatsApp status, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and he didn't within a year, everybody found out. Like you said, once Shabtai converts, everybody finds out. I mean, how does that happen? How does it spread? You mentioned previous ones, of emissaries. I was actually just talking to someone the other day about Usher Lemline, and people have told me, I don't even know who that is, because he didn't go anywhere, and it's only 100 years before or so, right. And that went nowhere. But he was in Germany. But meanwhile, when you have in Shabtai Tzvi, it just explodes, like you're saying, and that's really so.
Well, it works in there's kind of three-pronged approach. First of all, he travels a lot, right? He doesn't sit in Gaza, right? He knows the main hubs of the fundraising network in the Mediterranean, right? So he goes to up into Asia Minor, into Turkey, into Izmir, into Bursa, and visits those communities. He goes, of course, to Venice, right, in order to spread the word. And who does he speak to in Venice? Shmuel Abuab and Moshe Zakuto. And it's obvious why he's doing it, because these are the people who are sitting right in the middle of that network that he needs to use in order to spread the word, right? And throughout a lot of his life, he's on the move, right? He's an emissary, right? We've had emissaries for Pidyon Shuim, and we've had emissaries for Eretz Israel. We've had emissaries for the women of Jerusalem. And now Nathan is an emissary. And he's doing exactly what all the other emissaries do. In addition, right, he's using this network to spread information. So he's writing letters, lots of letters. I mean, some of them have survived. A lot of them are the same letter copied different ways. But he is spreading the information by word, right? He's also in contact with the people who are traveling around this network. As he travels around, he's meeting Sephardic merchants who are going up to Amsterdam or going to London or wherever it is that they're going. He's talking to them. So they become information bearers. He's writing lists. He begins to publish, right? Like the emissaries did. Like I said, all of the emissaries did that. It's an extra way of pushing when what you're trying to move as an emissary is to have books published, and you can take them with you and sell them and have them spread very widely across this network. And finally, what he does, which is really interesting, is that he sets up a literature of tikkunim, which is kind of not totally popular in the sense of, a very low level, but much more accessible ways of ritualizing a spiritual life, which is Sabbatean in its content. And he writes this stuff, and it is spread very widely. By the time he's doing that, it's a bit late. The publishers are already a bit antsy about publishing Sabbateanism, right? Because he's converted. So much of this remains in manuscript, but it is very widely spread. So he is in fact touching all the different levels of the community: the merchants who are traveling, the rabbis in place, intellectuals, and ordinary people, right? And it's that, and he does that because that's what he understands. He's a young man, right? That's the thing. It's a generational thing as well, I think, right? You have a guy he's the right guy in the right place. And it's brilliant. I mean, he is so successful in what he does. And it's manipulating that same network that sort of came together around Tach V'Tat, and he's now manipulating it for a different end.
Right, really, really fascinating. So that's how, like you said, that's the conclusion, the connection that you're showing between Tach V'Tat and Sabbateanism. So this, like I said, it relates to your book. This article, I mentioned already twice, mentioned again. I'll link to the book and to the previous podcast. And this article is it accessible? Can listeners find it? Is it on Academia? Where can they find this article?
I think I can put it on. It may well be on Academia. And if it isn't now, it will be very soon. It's published in Jewish History, but they'll be able to find it on Academia. I think it should be okay.
Okay, so I will try to link to that as well. People can check out your Academia page.
I just want to add one final point, and it's this, because this perspective on Sabbateanism gives us another way of thinking about it, right? So we're used to thinking of Sabbateanism as this kind of radical break in Jewish history, right? All of the religious certainties that came before are broken, right? And the Jewish world now is trying to reconstruct itself and get over this enormous crisis. Of course, that's true. I'm not saying that wasn't true. That was obviously true. However, it was also a constructive moment. So when we think about how our world functions, the interconnectedness of it, the way in which Jewish communities interact with each other and work with each other, what happened after 1648 and then with Sabbateanism are part of a much broader process of the development of interconnections between communities. In fact, they're a key moment of beginning for that. Right, so I'm not looking at how 1648 affected Sabbateanism. I'm suggesting that 1648 and Sabbateanism acted together, right, in order to bring the Jewish world that much closer, to strengthen the connections between communities, and so to play a constructive role in building a much more interconnected Jewish world. That's something that will develop, of course, afterwards. It's not the end, it's just the very beginning of the process. But it enables us in an interesting way to integrate Sabbateanism into the course of Jewish history in a different way. It's not just a break, and it's also a moment of growth. There we are.
Hey, really, like I said, it comes full circle from the beginning to the end, from the Tach V'Tat to where we have to Sabbateanism and how they interconnect. And it's a very, very interesting and compelling argument, as you made here on the podcast. And as, like I said, people can check out the article and read it for themselves. And once again, I thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.